If you're seeing this video, chances are you're trying to figure out the way to get the most appropriate exposure in ISO, ISO, that's the place to start. Let's talk. Internet, welcome back. This is Robert Teegarden here again with another tutorial. Today we are completing my series on the exposure triangle. I've already done a video about shutter speed and aperture. If you haven't already, you should check those things out, but we're talking about ISO. Before I get started, if you haven't already, I would love it if you would join this community. Consider subscribing, ringing the bell for post notifications. I post videos on a regular basis on filmmaking tips and the business of being a creative. So if this is something that interests you, why don't you join the community? We'll see you around a little bit more often, shall we? So what is ISO? Now, ISO really is the sensor sensitivity to light. A lot of Sally sells seashells by the seashore. And in photography, this is very helpful because it allows you to keep the appropriate exposure while not compromising your shutter speed. So if in a situation that has less than ideal light, I have something where I don't want any motion blur, so I don't need to have my shutter speed down, so I can snap and keep the image nice and crisp. I can boost my ISO, keep my aperture the same, and achieve the look that I want. It's really helpful in kind of fast-moving sports photography, those sorts of things. ISO really helps us out. With video, however, ISO is a way of increasing your exposure without changing your shutter speed or your aperture, which really means that you get to keep your creative choices in terms of motion blur and what your depth of field looks like. Now for this entire series, what I've been doing is correlating the exposure triangle to the elements of your eye. Now we're talking about ISO here, and like I said, this is more the sensitivity of how your sensor perceives light. Now there's not really a direct correlation to this in terms of your eye, at least nothing that I can think of, but I just wanted to be consistent, and so that's why, I mean, you guys, You get the point. Just trust me here. Now for videography, ISO comes into play very much in low light situations or times when ambient light is not ideal. So I do this a lot where I'm shooting at night or in dusk situations, things like wedding receptions, music videos, those sorts of things where the light is not in the daytime, basically, or situations where we're controlling the light and it's nice and bright. Now, just like the other videos in this series, there are limitations to the creative choices that you have. With ISO, we're talking about noise. Now, Iceland Aurora has a really great quote from their article that really helped me put this into perspective, and it says that ISO can be thought of as an amplifier. If you're shooting in low light, higher ISO will amplify the signal, but will also amplify the noise. So in most cases of less than perfect light, a higher ISO will have more noise than a lower ISO. Now, I really like this analogy, especially if you are a musician or have played guitar in any way, shape, or form. You know that if you have a nice, clean signal that is low in volume, if you continue to increase the gain, inevitably you get a lot of distortion in that signal. That's actually what's happening in a guitar distortion pedal. You're just increasing the gain. So the same thing could be thought of where ISO is concerned. The higher you increase the ISO or the gain, the more distortion in the image you'll have. Now this might actually be a little bit above the scope of this tutorial, but I thought I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that with certain picture profiles, mainly log modes and inside Sony cameras, there are certain ISO minimums that are required. So for example, if I'm shooting a log mode in an outdoor situation, which is ideal because in nighttime situations, there's really not a ton of difference in the contrast ratio, I would have to shoot at a minimum ISO of 800. Now that's actually reasonably high, especially if when I'm using this would be in a daylight situation. So I have to make other creative choices, either lowering my aperture, increasing my shutter speed, which are not ideal, or putting some type of ND filter, neutral density filter on my lens so that I can compensate for the fact that I have a higher exposure naturally, just shooting on a different picture profile that will allow me to add the different contrast ratios that I would like after the fact. So with that in mind, how do I handle my ISO in lower light situations? Now, in the times that I just mentioned, you know, they're nighttime or low light situations, maybe I'm shooting a wedding ceremony, I'm usually shooting somewhere in an aperture range of probably 2 to 2.8. My shutter speed is locked at 180 degrees. So if I'm shooting at 24 frames a second, it's at 1/50th. If I'm shooting in slow-mo, it's 1/250th of a second. So what I would be doing with my ISO is really cranking the thing up, but I don't really like to push my ISO past the limit of about 5,000. Now, most of the time, what we're seeing in cameras is that they're suggesting a limitation of 6,400. So newer cameras, especially larger full frame sensors, we have the ability to start to push the ISO range a little bit more. When you're starting to work with cinema cameras, that ability becomes even greater because you're dealing with different bit rates, and the sensor's capabilities are a lot stronger than in DSLRs and mirrorless DSLRs. And as technology continues to get better and better, we're starting to see cheaper and cheaper lighting solutions, as well as cheaper cameras with much greater ISO capabilities. With that in mind, if you haven't checked out the other videos in this series, I suggest you do so right now. They are bangers for sure. And with that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Robert Teegarden with another video in the can. Thank you so much for hanging out with us this time. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. We'll see you guys later. TTFN.